On my first day at AMS was when our daughter was born. And 1970 was a terrific year for us because it was AMS, our second child, a daughter, our first house we purchased, and our second car. I think I went all in on 1970. Energy behind it was Charles. He was the one whose father owned his own business and kind of suggested to us, wouldn't it be good to own your own business? And then it was really all of us, in the sense that we had been using computers, and we thought that computers had the capability to help people improve their operation. That's why Ivan and Charles left the Pentagon, and then 2 months later I left it and Pat left it, so that we didn't want to have all that payroll hit. And then the other thing that we did, which was good in retrospect, was Lambda Corporation was a corporation that had a lot of good talent in it, and we used them for studies when I was in the Pentagon. And we gave the Lambda people a 20% equity in AMS if they would provide the staff when we started to sell projects. So therefore we didn't have to hire people in advance of having some revenue coming in. So it was all a very well sort of articulated thing, at least at the start. I think at most we could maybe think in terms of 3 or 5 year futures. But thinking about what you could do, today was just, not within the realm. I don't know, Hugh Everett might have thought that, but or Ivan might have thought that, but not any of us. But it was one of those things where the technology kept on improving, and you were able to figure out how to make that new technology work for clients. And I think that people talk about what was the culture of the company. I think that the culture really was that you wanted to, help the client solve a problem. I mean, the client, and if you didn't figure that out, you probably weren't going to be successful. One of our first contracts was with Norton Company. They manufactured grinding wheels and sandpaper. And we got it because Charles had done some consulting work before he came to the Pentagon for the people. And so we went up, and he and I went up and visited with them. And the executive vice president said, our inventories are increasing faster than our revenues. Can you figure out how we can change that? And so we said, well, we'll give it a try. And so we came up with a study that basically said you should close a couple of warehouses and you should put mini computers in the other warehouses so that they could better contribute to the central computer and make it more efficient. But in order to do that project, we had to work out a project plan for the client. And that got us involved with the IT people in the client's organization. We turned in a couple of project plans, and they kind of found a lot of holes in them. And I remember this quite clearly. As we left one day, Charles said to me, Frank, he said, you work on the project plan, I'll work on the project, and we'll see who gets done first. I mean, sometimes it was challenging. You had to figure out, what was the motivation sometimes for certain people doing certain things. But you always felt that you had the talent. You had enough talent in order to get the job done. We used to kid a lot when we would say that we'd have personal assignment meetings, who's coming off of what project, who can be the person to do the best on the next project. But then we would have other kinds of meetings that would talk about finances, that would talk about certain factors. But every one of them turned into a personal assignment meeting because there was always more work that needed to get done than we had the staff to do it. And you're always trying to cobble around groups and teams of people in order to get the right mix to get the job done. My career was such for about the first 6 or 7 years. Most of the people who were there, tried to sell projects and get them executed. But eventually, after we went public, I became the chief financial officer. And then I became the chief human resources officer as we needed to recruit people. And eventually the chief administrative officer. So I figured I was Mr. Overhead in the organization. But it was very interesting, having that role, because as we expanded across the U.S. and as we went into different European countries, as we went into Australia, there was always a challenge of trying to figure out how should we do it, what should be the organization format that we should use. We had one, I think, advantage, that was certainly an advantage that I saw, is that we had one general ledger system. So closing the books at the month end or quarter end wasn't a problem, even with your German and your Spanish and your English and your US and your Australian companies, because there was all the same general ledger. So what we used to do is we used to use the US GAAP for our accounting, and then when we had to, we translated that into the books of the German authorities or the UK authorities or the Australian authorities. It was never, doing books in their currency and their formats and then trying to convert it into the US. It was a reverse flow. And it worked out pretty good. I remember going over to Germany and they were having their new Principals Day, which is when you get promoted. And so I was representing headquarters from the US. And I probably was a little bit defensive in talking to the German folks because, we had, our name was AMS Deutschland, so it had the American sort of in it. And I remember after talking to the people, and at the end, one of the young men came up and talked to me. He said, "Mr. Nicolai," he said, "don't worry that you're an American company. That's why I joined you." And it was my realization then that one of the reasons why we got a lot of good talent was that at that time there was a lot of Germans, and turns out there were a lot of UK people interested in working for an American company that they thought was, using the modern technology. Well, the DC schools were trying to respond to an order by a federal judge to make sure that no school had other than an average pupil expenditure, plus or minus 3%. So we got a contract to try to help the schools figure out how to do this. And the choice was to reallocate teachers rather than students. But each of these reallocations had to provide for some side constraints, like every school had to have a librarian, a phys ed teacher, etc. So the question, therefore, was what model could be used to make this reallocation? Well, Hugh Everett came up with one for us, and it was successful. And we had a lot of good feedback from the DC school system, but we never told them that this model was the one that Hugh had developed to allocate US nuclear warheads to Russian targets. But he said the mathematics were quite similar. As we grew in Roslyn, we were on about 4 or 5 different locations, and we thought it would be best to try to get ourselves all together into one building, and that turned out to be the Kent Street office building. And I remember Ivan telling me when we started to plan for this, he said, "Frank," he said, "this can either be the Nicolai building or the Nicolai Memorial building." But fortunately, it turned out to be a good choice. We did have one, in that particular building as it was being built, we wanted to rent and make use of the penthouse on the top floor. And we wanted to put in big windows so you could oversee the mall, could oversee the Washington Monument. I thought it would be great. So we went to Charles Smith, who was the builder. And he brought in Vlastimil Kubek, who was the architect. And Vlastimil says, "You can't do that with my building. That concrete face on that has to remain intact." And I remember telling Bob Smith, I said, "Bob, who's paying the rent on this building?" He said, "You are." I said, "Well, we want that penthouse the way we want it." And fortunately, we were able to convince him to do it that way. We wanted the signage to be the big AMS and the big letters. And so we had design it, and I think we had 10 foot by 10 foot high and wide letters. And we had to go to Arlington County to get their approval to do this. And the board basically would not give us approval to do it. They insisted that the letters be no more than 8 feet by 8 feet. And so Ivan and I had attended that meeting, and we were very disappointed. But after the building went up and those lighters went up, we were very glad that the county actually had the foresight to keep us from getting the 10-foot high lighters, because it would have been a disaster, I think. All I can say about Carmi is that when you were on the road out in Springfield, Illinois, or Worcester, Massachusetts, and you called into the AMS switchboard and you heard Carmi's voice, it gave you a lot of energy. You were glad that she was at the switchboard, and she helped you sort of get through the day. I mean, those were the days where there was a switchboard. And we had put together, a 5-year business plan showing what it is that we could do. And subsequently, years later, we asked the Lehman Brothers, why did you invest in us? Was it our brilliant plan? And they said, no, it wasn't really. He said, we thought there would be a future in information technology, and you 5 of you, you look like you're bright guys, and you might be able to do something. And that was it. Thank you all for coming. It's been a great pleasure to revisit with all of you again. And it's brought back a lot of terrific memories of the days that we spent together. So thank you very much.